Let me introduce myself. My name is Daniel Brand. I head marketing and communications at Innok Robotics. A warm welcome to the Lunch Learn webinar series from Innok. Today, our topic is fleet management because a single transport robot is great, but as soon as you have a second one, you really need a good conductor. What that can look like, I'll show you now in the following video. Here you can see how an Enduros transport robot autonomously opens the doors, but of course everything is controlled by the fleet management system, seamlessly moving from outside back into the hall. And in a moment, we'll see a few more scenes where our guests from NAiSE at their event last year put the robot a bit, I wouldn't say to its limits, but they really explored what autonomous outdoor driving means. You all had a lot of fun with that, and our guest will tell us more about it in a moment. So that's just a quick preview. And at this point, I'd like to welcome our guests. First, Alwin Heerklotz, Managing Director of Robotics, and Kai, Founder and also Managing Director of NAiSE. I'll start with our guest. Kai, would you like to briefly introduce yourself so that our listeners know who we're talking to today?
Yes, maybe a few words about myself. Privately, I am young. And professionally, I'm part of the management at NAiSE, and as you mentioned earlier, I work on how to efficiently coordinate fleets of mobile robots in mixed environments.
Over to you.
Exactly. Yes, I'm Gunther Zion, CTO of Innok Robotics. At some point during my studies, I realized that most manufacturers of AMRs actually completely ignore outdoor environments. Later on, after spending a lot of time, we realized in 2018, we moved to standard products. Based on our technology, we then launched the Enduros here behind me and the Reynos, the irrigation, brought them to market, and yeah. Now we're actually scaling up based on these two products, and we're roughly doubling every year, and it looks like that's going to continue. And of course, we see that we're also entering a market that very interested in solutions for outdoor areas and actually also for indoor areas with poor flooring.
Great. At this point, I have a very important note for our participants, for our guests. Please feel free to use the Quanda section for your questions. Sometimes we can't keep up with the chat. It always happens in webinars. So for questions that I will ask Alwin and Kai at the end, please make good use of the Quanda section. And then let's get started, because Innok is presenting its own fleet manager at Logimat this month, actually in about 2 weeks. Still, today we have NAiSE as a guest, and Innok also deliberately works with many fleet providers. Alwin, could you briefly explain to us the background, let's say, of this dual strategy?
Yes, well, maybe we've been a bit unclear in our marketing. What we've actually done is we've basically added the most important fleet manager functions to our autonomy software so that those who might already be using a vehicle now have the option to add a second or third vehicle without having to set up a full-fledged fleet manager right away. It's now a lean solution that ultimately represents a full-fledged fleet manager.
There's really no way to manage vehicles from other manufacturers here, or maybe even include forklifts.
Armin probably just set you up perfectly for this. Bring us up to speed. From your perspective, when does a customer actually need a cross-manufacturer system like yours? And what happens in logistics if that's missing?
Yeah, that's already being hinted at. Basically, such a manufacturer-independent fleet system comes into play when we have automated material flow in a
Cover things on a holistic level. We're talking about mixed traffic in terms of traffic control when I have robots from different manufacturers, but also still robots operating together with manual operations, classic forklifts, tug trains. In the end, these systems are isolated solutions that don't really communicate with each other, or at least don't speak the same language. And that's where we see ourselves as translators, as mediators, and as traffic controllers in certain traffic situations, making sure that these bottlenecks don't happen. But of course, there's also the perspective that all these resources, mobile robots, manual traffic, forklift trains, each have a function. We're still talking about intralogistics, for example, and about material flow, and material flow is complex. What I'm trying to say is when I deliver something from the warehouse to the production line, transport it, these are multi-stage sections carried out by different resources, which ideally are perfectly coordinated with each other. And that's something where it's also our responsibility to make sure that we distribute cleanly and efficiently to the vehicles.
Great. Thank you very much for the overview. With NAiSE, we have
not today. Successful customer. The second one is currently ongoing.
our existing software and hardware along with NAiSE's software just worked together perfectly, and that provided the corresponding benefits to the customer, to the end customer as well.
So we can see that customers are already using vehicles from other manufacturers indoors and are now, for the first time, considering or realizing that there is a solution to also operate outdoors. And of course, in that case, you want a solution where both the existing indoor vehicles and our vehicles, which can also operate outdoors, can interact together or work together as a complete solution. That we have a solution where our vehicles together with other vehicles on the route can be coordinated to drive together. That was really something special for us, and that's exactly what it now enables for the customers. To continue outside, whether that's into another hall or even outside, for example, in the outdoor warehouse. And for us, that really was a huge milestone, to actually have a project that we implemented together with customers.
Great, thank you. Kai, from your, let's say, software perspective, what is special for you about now, for the first time having autonomous vehicles that can seamlessly move from indoors to outdoors, driving outside? Was that what, for you, also a new field, or had you always covered that in theory? How should we imagine that from your perspective?
Actually, the outdoor area is an area that you, at least from a traffic perspective, from a traffic management perspective, see differently. It really is quite distinct. Indoors, we mostly have static corridors. And accordingly, there are also predictable routes and paths indoors. So at the route planning level, it's much easier to coordinate traffic and proactively avoid bottlenecks and jams. Whereas in the automotive area, we have the situation that we're out in the open. That's how I call it. That means the options for where conflicts might come from, like manual vehicles could appear, so are much more varied. They could come from different directions, which for us as fleet managers, as traffic managers, means that we work much more with so-called traffic zones, with relative traffic zones. And that's exactly where we realized that our software with these relative traffic zones, with traffic zone management, in addition to the route planning, works really well, can complement scenarios. That's why we're very pleased that we've found such a harmonizing solution between Innok and NAiSE.
Great, thank you very much. And we're always very honest. So let me throw the ball back to Alwin. What are the things you really need to keep an eye on? I mean, I don't want to say where do things get stuck in a project like this, but what should a user on the customer side keep in mind, or maybe also what are the general things to consider in fleet management? Where can things get stuck? So what are the things that both of you, or where NAiSE and Innok have also developed and learned together? Kai already touched on it a bit, but from your perspective, what are the things where you've already learned a lot in existing customer projects and are still learning?
Yes, a very, very important component is, of course, that you structure and prepare processes in advance for automation. These can be trivial things, like already thinking about where, for example, if like us, you're transporting trailers, where are the appropriate parking spots for trailers? Where do the vehicles drive? Do they stay on the edge? Do they go down the middle? Where can you overtake? Where are there maybe passing spots? Things like that. If you think about that in advance, then of course it's easier than if you only start thinking about it during commissioning and then have to completely change the concept that was maybe just roughly planned before. Another important point is, of course, the interfaces to other infrastructure components like gates or elevators, traffic lights, and so on. It's good if all that is clarified beforehand. We now always guide our customers through that process, so we discuss it in advance so that by the time of commissioning, all questions are answered and you can start putting the vehicle into operation as planned.
So you could almost say, there's a lot of responsibility in this three-way setup, on the customer side, on the Innok side, and on the fleet manager side, right?
Absolutely, yes, that definitely changes things. If I commission a vehicle without a fleet manager, then it's just us and the customer. That's obviously by its very nature much simpler than when you have to coordinate between three parties. The concept behind NAiSE is also that the customer does a lot themselves. We also see that customers are generally very capable of handling the fleet manager and making changes themselves. In the projects we do on our own, it's usually the case that the customer often has no experience with automation, so we basically have to guide them and explain what's possible with the vehicle and how they might need to adjust their processes. Now, in this three-party setup, it's more like we deliver a component, which is the robot with its autonomy. Maybe also things like connecting these processes, and other topics are more in the area of the fleet manager. That does, of course, change the interaction. So it's good if the customer is also aware of this division of roles.
Do you see it that way too, Kai? So also responsibility not just on the supplier's side, in this case NAiSE, but also on the customer's side. What are the typical stumbling blocks you see there, or that you sometimes notice?
Absolutely. This question of responsibility, it's always present, and you have to communicate it clearly and early to the customer. We have a dynamic system that moves through the aisles. We don't have a closed fenced-off machine where you can assume after the acceptance date that it will run the same from day one to the end. That means with this dynamic, you have to constantly work with it. You have to keep making adjustments, changes. They affect the system. That's something where someone on the shop floor has to take action, and that's usually the customer. So it's really important to communicate this early on. But I also want to agree with Alwin that it's crucial the customer doesn't treat the topics of mobile robots and central fleet managers as completely separate until the project starts, which actually happens quite often, but instead seeks a trilateral discussion very early on, maybe even at the beginning, so that everyone can recognize and tackle the challenges together, because everything has to work hand in hand. That's definitely one of those pitfalls. In general, Alwin, you already mentioned you can't just put a mobile robot somewhere and expect it to create an automated material flow. The environment, I have to say, has to be made robot ready. These are things like how the corridors need to be designed, clear rules about where pedestrians are, where robots are supposed to move. But those are also the kinds of issues we're dealing with. Of course, I need a completely different network quality than what I've needed up to now. All these topics are, of course, present. What I also always notice is the topic of VDA 5050 compliance. Lately, we've had to learn that the VDA 5050 protocol is not actually a standard. I often use the wrong wording for that myself. It's a recommendation, a protocol recommendation, which is a very good one. And there is you should use it as it is recommended, or at least want to use it that way. And there are many cases where the interface is really neglected. With Innok, we've had a wonderful experience there. Innok took the interface, the recommendation from the VDMA very seriously and implemented it cleanly, and we were then able to, through joint work, ultimately achieve a high-quality integration into our system.
Okay, great. That's of course nice to hear, and I know it from other industries as well. I myself have a strong agricultural background, and there's the ASOBUS protocol. My goodness. Sometimes the manufacturers really butt heads over it because so much is left undefined, and then suddenly a device won't work with a tractor, or vice versa. Luckily, that's not something we see here with you. Hopefully, we'll soon be making a great customer video together. And I'm already looking forward to that, of course, from a marketing perspective. But for now, I'd also like to give you a bit of an outlook. Logimat is just around the corner. Kai, you're also in Robotics Hall 8, where we are as well. I think that's going to be a very, very attractive hall again. And now we're looking a bit into the crystal ball, not really. What highlights will Logimat bring us this year? You've already announced them. We've already announced them too, but more like, what do you think? Where is this topic of fleet management heading in the next 3, maybe even up to 5 years? Not an easy question, but for me, just look into the crystal ball now. Alwin, would you like to start?
Gladly. So, I mean, what I think we'll definitely see is that a fleet manager like this will become more and more standard, at least in larger companies. Anyone using autonomous vehicles might already have one, or is right now maybe deciding on a fleet manager. I think that in the coming years it will develop so that it's simply standard to have one, and that you'll have to integrate your vehicles into it. And then you might have advantages or disadvantages depending on which one you chose. But what I also believe is that AI is coming up more and more in many areas now, and I think it will come into this field as well. This will probably lead to interfaces changing as well. Ultimately, of course, vehicles themselves will become more and more autonomous, making independent decisions and reacting to dynamic changes in the environment. And I think the role will also of the fleet manager have to adapt, in that a vehicle might sometimes drive around an obstacle on its own, or decide that certain parts of a route are not possible, or whatever else. I believe cases like these, how to deal with this dynamic environment, But in the end, you always have to integrate that into the fleet manager. And I think you're well positioned if you have a fleet manager that's open to new concepts. Yeah, what we currently still see pretty rarely is ERP integration or integration into other WMS systems, EMS, whatever else. I think that will become much more common because now when you look at what people decide transferring something from one system to another, that's going to change. If you automate both systems, then there are no people involved anymore. So you have to deal with completely different conditions. Yeah, and ultimately, of course, as you add more intelligence, I think this topic, making decisions proactively as well. So if I have a lot of orders to process, then maybe I can plan ahead and handle changing requirements. That might also mean having to replan. Those, I think, are the main topics. Okay.
Interesting. Kai, what's your perspective, your take on this?
Alex had a good example. So this forward-looking planning, that's a huge topic. From a fleet manager's point of view, from a conductor's perspective, so to speak. But there are two different perspectives here. On the one hand, there's the perspective where I know what's going to be done and can predict and calculate everything purely mathematically, how it should best be managed throughout the day. But in most cases, I'm in a situation where I don't really know, I don't have the full schedule for the entire day in front of me. And that's why we've been focusing a lot on other methods that might be able to predict that after all. And AI plays an important role in that. In 2023, in a joint project with Continental and other partners called TIASI, we started developing 1 or 4 different AI models. The idea is that we can do what's called forecasting of order volume and battery levels, and thus availability based on past data, based on the data set, and then regardless of whether the information is available, we can still make these predictions. We're already active with this in 2 test instances. But what I want to say is that we will integrate this step by step, and I believe this will be the absolute focus, like in the coming years, that at the fleet management level with a kind of assistant, let's say an AI assistant, you'll be able to give users many more forecasts for the future, much more reliable forecasts for the future, and maybe not just forecasts, but also perhaps take over some decisions. At first with a decision recommendation, and maybe in the very distant future with fully automated decision making, once the robustness and user trust are there.
That could theoretically also make a question from the audience much easier. We actually have a question from the audience, and we're getting close to our half-hour break, which we usually take. But of course, we're not doing that now because we still have a question, Kai, and this one is directed specifically at you. So the question is, how does it work in your program, for example, if in Enduro's vehicles from another company are used together? How much effort does the customer have with the software, and how flexible is the program if, in a very specific example, the route of other vehicles is changed, for instance?
Classic. It depends, but I'll try to illustrate it with an example. I'll assume that we mobile robots that have this VDA 5050 interface, and with that they should be able to use a shared network of nodes and paths. And because of that, the change of the route of one vehicle, so to speak, affects the routes of the other vehicle as well. But if that weren't possible, and we had 2 vehicles in 2 different worlds, in our software, we always bring these 2 vehicles, these 2 resources into a reference world. That doesn't have to happen only based on the VD 5050 node edge structure. It can also be done purely on a coordinate world level. And there, even if the vehicles don't use the node edges, we can still manage the traffic between the vehicles while using so-called traffic zones. Basically, it's always important we integrate different vehicles now from over 30 manufacturers. More than 114 different variants are compatible. If systems are already compatible and in use, then it's more or less, exaggeratedly speaking, a plug-and-play situation. If not, the system still needs to be integrated by us. From experience, for example, with VDR vehicles, this is a 4 to 6 week process. And then we have that plug-and-play setup again.
Okay, so there is some effort involved. A customer can't just drag and drop the robot's route and have everything else automatically adjust. They really have to think it through.
Yes and no. If I have a second network, I can go straight into edit mode in our software and change the route directly. So really by drag and drop, and once you save, it immediately affects the vehicles. So unless the vehicle happens to be at that node at that exact second, it will be able to take the new node into account.
So yes, there's some effort to get it up and running, but then the customer gets a lot of benefits. To both of you, thank you very, very much. Did I forget anything? Is there anything else you wanted to add, or can we wrap up this wonderful session today? Alwin, do you have anything else?
Nothing special, right? I'm, of course, looking forward to many new customers who also want to integrate the NAiSE Fleet Manager with our vehicles. I think the potential behind it is huge. The issue of skilled labor shortages is everywhere, and now is the right time to implement automation.
Kai, your final words for today?
We have exciting times ahead, and Innok and NAiSE will play an important role in that together as well. That's why I always recommend the best way is not to mess it up. Use our channels from Innok, stay in touch, and we're here. So write to us. We support you with your projects together. It's easier than you might think.
Great, thank you as well for these wonderful closing words. Together we're stronger. Today we had a fantastic trio. Client, Innok, and NAiSE. Thank you for listening. Thank you for being with us, and goodbye. Have a great day.